So hello to everybody. Thank you for tuning in if you're live, and if you're not live, then thank you of course too. I'm afforded the opportunity here to speak with Matt Dillahunty, which is an intellectual hero of mine, and we've just been discussing how you shouldn't meet your heroes, and so all good. I created a video dedicated to Matt Dillahunty's position on free will, and more particularly on compatibilism, which I've linked in the description. And Matt has had the time to watch it and has notes ready to have a conversation with me. So without further ado, we're just going to dive straight into it. So Matt, what was wrong with my video?
Almost nothing. And that's the fun part is, I don't tend to watch YouTube videos. I don't tend to listen to podcasts. I mean, that's true. I've been doing events with Sam now for a while, and I don't think I've ever listened to a full episode of Waking Up. I just don't have the time in the schedule. And so people were like posting on Twitter, "Oh, you need to go watch this video from Rationality. Really takes you down on, compatibilism." And I was like, yeah, whatever. And it was actually Anthony Magnabosco, who was just here at the house, but I don't know, a week or so ago, whenever it was, you had posted a video on Jordan Peterson's Truth Thing. And I was like, crap, people keep linking me this guy's videos. So I watched the Jordan Peterson one first because I've got a thing coming up with him, and I thought it was great. And I was like, well, what issues could this guy possibly have with, what I said? So I watched the video on me and compatibilism. And the funny thing is, my wife was sitting next to me on the couch. She wasn't watching the video, but she could hear it. And I would pause and jot down some notes. And she would, from off to the side, go, "Yeah, I think he's right." And I was like, I know, I'm writing that down now, but I think he's right. So I didn't get a chance to go back and listen to it this morning because something else came up. That was the intent. There's a couple things, and this is going to be kind of loose because this is the notes. So jump in and clarify or whatever else.
Yeah.
But I think the first note I took was a question from you of why call it free will and not just will.
Yes. Just for anyone listening, we are just jumping into it. So if you want the context for this conversation, if you don't already know Matt's previous positions, if I can say that, because it sounds like you've slightly changed on certain things. And if you haven't seen the video that I created, then it will just give you the context to understand the conversation that's happening now. So yeah, go ahead. Tell me the answer.
Yeah. So the short version is I really don't care whether somebody refers to it as will or free will. It's not a big enough deal for me. And that's not a dismissal of semantics, because as we talked about before, semantics is important. It's about word usage and what they mean. And you can't have communication without it. So when people say, oh, that's just a semantic argument, I want to scream, that's the one you should be having first. Let's get to the usage. I'm not particularly bothered if somebody wants to call it will, because what I'm largely talking about is the desires of agents and to what extent they are limited either by the physical laws of the universe versus some other agent's actions. But I do think that there may be some justification for calling it free will. Although I think that actually comes up a bit later in the notes, because I think you came back to this issue of calling it will versus free will. And the examples that I tried to use, some of them that you called out, I just kind of have to agree with, but there's a few things that I take issue with. But there was shortly after that, you had a clip of me saying something, and you followed it up with, "Are you sure about that?" So I wanted to address that. No, I'm actually not sure. Nor am I claiming certainty about anything. And it was about a statement I made about what most people think of with regard to free will. And this was the first point where my wife jumped in to say, "You were right." And I was like, I know, I'm already writing this down. Because upon reflection, I think what I was talking about was from the standpoint, my standpoint of, after acknowledging that libertarian free will isn't real, that that's just nonsense. When you get rid of that part that's not real and start looking at the other things that people care about related to free will, I think that what I was presenting is what people care about if you were able to kind of drill down to that. So, and by what they care about, the example I'd used was Sam could jump off the stage or I could throw him off the stage, and the end result's essentially the same. The difference between those two is all about two agents and their desires and which one's going to be imposed on another one. Everything about that gets you to moral responsibility, which is one of the foundational things that people care about with free will. Even Sam and I were in agreement on that. We're also in agreement that whether you have free will or not, there's still a rational justification for moral accountability, or
Correct.
at least agent accountability, if you don't want to go down the moral thing. You know, if my lawnmower is broken, my lawnmower is broken. It doesn't matter whether it had free will to break. And I think so. The contra-causal free will stuff, the libertarian stuff that people are like, oh yes, if I could go back in time, I would do it differently. I really think that they're not recognizing that what they're saying is, if I could go back in time with the knowledge I have now, some of them may be saying, if we rewound the clock, I would do it differently. And that's just bizarre. I mean, that's, I see no justification for saying that would happen. But I think, and this is a suspicion of mine, and it probably doesn't apply to everybody. So the mistake in my part was to kind of forcibly say, what people really care about is this, when I have no evidence that that's what really care about. This is what I suspect. If you were able to talk to them and say, okay, what's your concern here? Why is it that you want to have free will? Oh, well, then it makes sure that I'm not merely a puppet of the universe, that I get to make decisions. And they don't seem to recognize the difference between an agent with a brain that is capable of reflection on past incidents and to consider the potential cause of action that makes a decision. It doesn't matter whether it happens pre-consciousness. They seem to think that if you say you don't have free will, you are now a meat robot that doesn't have that self-reflection, that doesn't have the ability to change future decisions based on past results, which neither samurai say.
Yeah, no, I see the angle that you're going from. There is something that needs to be retained. I'm completely on board with you there. I think the word to use is will rather than free will, and I have several reasons for that, which we can dive into further. But on the point of where you were saying, when people say, "Oh, I would have done, I would have done that differently," you're right. Anyone that accepts determinism, they mean that in the sense that they, with the knowledge they have now, they would go back and do it differently. I know that for sure. But because most people are not people that accept determinism, most people are religious, for example, and they are religious in the kind that isn't deterministic, like Calvinists, etc. I think that when they say it that way, what's implicit is that they could have done otherwise, with or without the knowledge. They made a mistake and they would want to have done it otherwise. And that seems to be the case for when you're talking with anybody who doesn't really understand, who isn't interested in philosophy, and who doesn't understand the compatibilist position. The thing is we're born with the illusion of free will. It's not like a cultural thing. It's not a product of religion. We are born and we experience the world, and this illusion is incredibly powerful. So the default position is that we all experience the illusion of free will. And so I think it's right to say, listen, that illusion, that free will is wrong. You have will, and that's all you should care about, and here's why. But that illusion is wrong. What I see compatibilism as doing is going in and redefining free will. You can do that because I agree with you when you say it's just language. Language isn't authority; it's tools, and we can define it if we like. But I think we're not going to get the result that we want as fast as if we just called it will. Because when you say to somebody, "Listen, you don't have free will, but you have will," what you are, they will listen, in the sense that you're saying that is really an illusion, the thing that you're actually caring about right now. But this part isn't.
It seems to be part of whether or not the inclusion of the free modifier brings along too much baggage compared to the benefits. And there's a couple of notes I had here, because this was the sticking point of the whole thing, and it's really not that much of a sticking point because I'm okay with talking about it as well. So you talked about it's as if I'm saying paranormal magic is real, it's just not paranormal.
Yeah, so yeah, that was a good angle to come with, because when you were originally saying real magic isn't real, but fake magic is real,
Yeah.
it is, if you take that analogy and you apply it correctly, in my opinion, to free will and the situation historically and as it is right now, you're not saying real magic is fake, but fake magic is real. You are saying that real paranormal magic is fake, but fake paranormal magic is real. I used
I
the
think
word disingenuous then. I just wanted to apologize for that. I've realized subsequently that the word disingenuous means something slightly different here than what it does US.
I've
So,
been I've had worse accusations in the 20 minutes preceding the show. So
of course,
there is a
I'm
mild,
British. I have to be apologetic.
yeah, it's not so much as Canadians or,
No.
but I think there's a slight problem with the analogy in that what I'm saying and put it into the actual terms is that free will, as people have traditionally viewed it, is not free in the sense that they have traditionally viewed it, but is still free in another sense. Um, the attributes that some people have valued about free will, I'm definitely not going to be saying most ever again because that was a sticking point. They're not free in the sense that they previously thought. They're not free from all constraints. They're not free from causality and determinism. But there's still value in recognizing that the occasions where they are and are not free from constraints by other agents. So if
Yes.
you tie me to a chair, you are taking an action that prevents me from doing the thing that I want to do. There's a if I pick up a gun and shoot you, or if somebody puts a gun in my hand and aims it at you and has me pull the trigger,
Hmm.
or if somebody puts me in a scenario whether it's, I have to choose between shooting you or shooting 4 children. Um, those scenarios are mildly different with respect to how my will is being infringed or impeded, and yet in all the instances, I'm pretty much the agent taking action.
Yeah.
So there was a Sicily analogy that you brought up from Sam, um, and I have a massive problem with it, which I will let you rip apart so that it's not a problem at all.
Sure. Just before you jump on it, to
Yeah.
go to your analogy with the gun, we could either say that Matt shot Steve according to his own free will, and it was unencumbered. There was no extortion or no coercion. He just did it. Or we can say that Matt consciously chose to shoot Steve, so he did it according to his free will, but under the duress of someone having a gun to him. The point being is that it's still your conscious action, it's still free will, but there's extortion on it. So one of the best arguments I've actually seen for still calling it free is you could say that will is what you do consciously, deliberately, and free will is how you would define it if there's no extortion, there's no coercion. So I just wanted to kind of
Do
add that in.
you make a distinction between will and desire?
Will and desire. I guess will has more to do with action, in the sense that you can desire something, whereas a will, to be
Okay.
fair, I'm open to seeing the words however they want to be defined. I don't want certain terms or words to be redefined when they absolutely mean something else at the present, and it's not just because it's an arbitrary definition. It's because we're
Yeah, no.
born with the solution, etc.
I'm pretty much in agreement. I was asking this for clarity because there are times when I have had will and desire in my head as the same thing, and free will being relating to impositions on my ability to achieve or work to achieve those desires. If instead we're looking at will and desire as desire is what you want and will is what you do on behalf of what you want, um, then it may be that we've kind of shifted things, or that we're talking about it in you go desire to will, and I had desire and will as co-equal, so it was will and free will, or whether or not your will is impeded. I don't know if that's completely
Yeah.
accurate, but I
No,
just thought
I mean,
worth clarifying.
yeah, no, it is definitely worth clarifying the words, of course, that we want to use. I think ultimately, as you were saying earlier, what people want to use for words to describe certain beliefs or certain things, I don't really mind. It can confuse situations, and it can not lead to the result as effectively as using other words. For example, a lot of people have said to me, an atheist is somebody who claims to know that no gods exist.
Yeah.
And at first, I used to respond to that going, that's not what it is. And now that I've got a bit more of a nuanced opinion on the matter, I now say, if you want to define atheism that way, fine, but then I'm not an atheist. And I
Right.
don't think anyone basically is, because no one really, I mean, it's an absurd position in that
There are
sense.
people who will claim to be, but they're absurd.
Exactly. So you get that. Well, the same is with free will in that sense. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's
Oh,
just, I think a lot of this is going to come down to there's a context in which I think there's some value,
mhm.
and not just like I know that Sam's pointed out that Dennett is somewhat worried about what happens if people become convinced that they don't have free will, and so he wants
Yeah.
to maintain the word. I don't want to maintain the word for that. I
No.
think there's a context in which free is a relatively reasonable descriptor, even if it's not accurately mapped to the previous understanding.
So, I
Go
was
ahead.
just going to say that when it comes to Dennett, I can see why he wants to keep the word. And it's because, as you were just saying, he sees value in it. He thinks that, bad things are essentially going to happen if we lose that word, and it's worth keeping. And he's referenced studies, etc., about how people act when they believe they have free will and how they don't in other situations. I find those studies to be flawed, and I will in the future produce a video on why I think that's the case. But I understand him making a case, an argument for it. But if you don't seem to care about the words, then surely just choosing the word that's better in the current context is just the best choice to make. If you say the word will, then everybody really gets what you're saying. It only takes a little bit on top to say, this is what I mean by will. Whereas when you say free will, it's just the case that everybody seems to have a different definition. So I've got an analogy that I brewed up earlier on, and so it's incomplete. But if I can run it past you, I think it will convey exactly where I'm coming from, and maybe
Let,
you
let
can.
me
Yeah.
let me jump in on that and then do the analogy, because I try and fail on occasion, but I try to be very specific. I don't know if there's an instance of me using the term free will without also describing as precisely as time will allow what I'm talking about. I tend to, these discussions about free will that I have all tend to be surrounded like, hey, let's define libertarian free will is nonsense, and we're going down this road, and I'm a compatibilist, and I mean that this way, whether Dennett means it that way or not, although I'm massively informed by Dennett's work. But I wouldn't ever use free will without a clarification of what I don't think that I would ever use free will without a clarification of what my usage is and how it's distinct from what other people think.
Yes,
And
I've
so
I've seen that myself with you talking. You have absolutely always clarified that. Don't you think that's a problem? Like, you
no, I
almost
think
always
that's great.
have to say that. If you was to just say, I don't believe in free will, but I believe in will, that almost nothing else really has to be said, or certainly not as much as always having to caveat, always
Well, it would
having
be
to
like
make
saying I
clear.
don't believe in, yeah, well, I kind of do it when I talk about morality too, is when I
Mm,
talk about morality, I clarify that I'm talking about well-being. And I could say, I don't believe there's morality, I believe there's well-being, except I think the two are tied. And similarly, I think there's a case. So when we talked about the comment from Krauss that I referenced that I thought was brilliant, and now I'm not as keen on it because Krauss's use of nothing is vastly removed from the philosophical ex nihilo and stuff. And so it's
yeah.
probably a bridge too far. But when I'm describing free will, I don't think it's as far removed from the traditions surrounding free will. It's like saying you don't have free will in the sense that you thought you did, but you may have another type of will that could be called free, which is, in Dennett's book was The Varieties of Free Will Worth Wanting. And he goes through and he describes the various ones and says, yeah, you definitely don't have this, and this. But if you care
Mm,
about free will, or you care about wanting to keep that notion that you are not being impeded by other agents, here's this variety.
mm.
But
See, that reminds me of the analogy with Sicily and Atlantis.
which
It's
I have an issue with.
Yes. So how about you unpack your issue and
Well,
you tell me
just
what I'm missing?
either you can insert the original statement or you could re-give the analogy, and then I can tell you what I objected to.
Sure. Not quite as articulate as Mr. Harris, but essentially, we live in a world where historically and now people believe that the city of Atlantis exists, the underwater city, and compatibilists are coming along. But basically, we've realized that it doesn't. It doesn't exist. There is no Atlantis. Now, compatibilists seem to be coming along and saying, "Hey, actually, Atlantis is Sicily," and some are replying, "Well, it's not. It's not underwater." And they go, "No, no, 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 no. Listen, it's got buildings, it's got commerce, it's got people, it's got all you care about." And the problem is that to most people, when they say Atlantis, they mean that it's underwater. So saying here's Sicily and that's what you should care about is, I mean, I'm doing a butcher job really of Sam's position or
No worries.
analogy here, but it's basically Harris's point is that when it comes to free will, people care about the free bit, just as when it comes to Atlantis, they care about the underwater bit in this analogy. Whereas saying, "Oh, it's not underwater, but we do have Sicily," is like saying, "Ah, it's not free, but we have will, but we're going to call it free will." Or it's not underwater and it doesn't fit the description of Atlantis, but we're going to call it Atlantis. It's it seems insincere in that point. And I think that's the point he was trying to get across.
Yeah, and so there's an aspect of the story that may be entirely wrong in my head, but when I think of Atlantis, um, wasn't it originally on the surface and then sank, or was it
It
always underwater?
I don't know my history of it, but I think the point being, even if the analogy is not perfect, which I'm sure you could damn well be right there, the point being, the central thesis is that people believe that it's underwater. It doesn't really matter if they
Sure.
used to believe if it was up, but if that's the case, then yeah, the analogies. I mean, it's not perfect for other reasons as well that I was
Yeah, and
going
so
through.
when I look at that, what if we were to discover that Sicily was that the description that once upon a time there was an Atlantis,
Hmm.
and it was just a city like any other, and there were all kinds of myths and legends built up about it, that directed people to, oh, it's underwater and it's in this part of the Mediterranean or wherever, and we can't find it. And then we found that no, what actually happened is there was a city that was referred to by some as Atlantis, and after a period of time and wars, it became known as Sicily, and that portion of the history was lost. If we could then say that Sicily is, we would be justified in saying that Sicily is Atlantis. It just doesn't have all this supernatural glom on it. In that case, Sam's right that this is in part what compatibilists are trying to do, but it's by using the Atlantis thing. I think it adds a level of absurdity to it that isn't necessarily accurate, because if we look at the concerns people have about, am I free to make decisions? Am I being impeded? All these other things. The fact that you're not able to do it in a contra-causal fashion or libertarian fashion, it's like stripping away. It's like stripping away the legends around King Arthur.
Mm.
And there wasn't an Excalibur and a Lady of the Lake, but he was. And I'm not saying this is true because my history on this is awful too. Um, that he was a real figure. I've seen it. I've seen people do it with, was Paul Bunyan real? Was Arthur real? Was this real? If we could make a case for that, but at the end of the day, it's Sicily now, and I'm okay with
Hmm.
calling it Sicily. But if we had good reason to think that the two were at least tied together, I think it would be disingenuous to say, "Oh, that's not Atlantis; it's Sicily."
Yeah.
And what the compatibilists are saying, it's Sicily, but it once upon a time was Atlantis, and we've, you know, I don't know that it's so much of a
Okay.
bad thing. It's a great little kind of dig, but I don't know that it refutes anything about what compatibilists are saying.
You see, it's great. I think now that I'm thinking about Atlantis, I think the myth does come from actually a Greek city that did experience an earthquake and go into the water, if I remember correct.
Yeah,
But
I want to use it with Pompeii too. So
yeah, but I think what you just said, it doesn't work for the reason that what matters is what people mean by Atlantis. And what they mean is that it's underwater. So with that context, we can say, well, it once wasn't underwater, and then it was, and then we've now got this conception that it is underwater still, even though really compatibilists are saying no, it's never been underwater. It's actually Sicily. But when it comes to free will, there isn't a before. There wasn't a moment where we didn't have this pervasive illusion. It's always been this way. We always, since soon as we are conscious, I was going to say since we're born, but we're not. It's as soon as the mind gets to a certain development, we have this illusion of free will, and it doesn't go. It doesn't go even when you know it's an illusion. So me and you know it's an illusion, the traditional sense of free will, but we're still experiencing it right now. It's still an illusion. Some people have said, well, no, once you know it, it's not an illusion, but that's not the case. I assume you agree with me on that case. The example I would use is if you bring up a, yeah,
you know, I can look at an optical illusion. I can know exactly that these two colors are the same, and I know what's tricking me, and I will always see them as different in that context.
Yeah, so, exactly, and that's the same with free will.
But the Sicily analogy and the objection against compatibilism seems to me like saying, yes, we know that these two things aren't the same, but we want to tell people that they're wrong to see them as the same, when in fact it's unavoidable that they see the illusion of what they view as free will as free will.
Yeah.
And the clarification would seem to be, for me, yes, what you're experiencing is an illusion. You definitely see these two colors as the same. You definitely think that you have this old version of free will, but here's the actual fact. And there's nothing wrong. And there may be some value in people understanding that it's okay to see both of the colors as the same while simultaneously knowing that they are different.
So if we run with the paper and it's moving, that's how we perceive it. And that's how people have perceived free will. The illusion is happening, that we have free will and the paper is moving. If people were saying to you, the paper is moving, Matt, and you were saying, no, it's not. What you actually care about is that you see it as moving, even though it's not. And they were telling you, and the world at large was basically expressing that no, what they actually care about, what they're building policies on, what religion basically is founded on, is that that's moving. Wouldn't it be better to just say, listen, I'm not going to redefine the word moving or redefine the word illusion. I'm just going to say to it isn't moving, but here's some other things to consider, because that's what I do with free will. I say, listen, you haven't got free will, but you do have will. This might be a good time for me to give you an analogy that I was going to give earlier, because it just shines a bit more context on this. This isn't perfect, but it's just to illustrate what I see compatibilists doing with the word. So imagine if you had a friend come up to you and say, hey, Matt, I've just inherited $100 million, but I can't have it for 2 years. That's just the nature of the will. And then you go away and you do some research and you look into it and you find out that he hasn't got $100 million. He's actually got $1 million. There's a multitude of things that you can then do, but there seems to be 3 that are prominent. One is that you just don't say anything at all. And in 2 years, he finds out that he hasn't got $100 million. He's only got 1 million. I made that sound bad, but that's still pretty good. But 2, and this is what I feel like Harris is doing and myself, you can go, hey, mate, come have a beer. I need to talk to you. And then you can say, listen, you don't have $100 million, but you do have $1 million. And let me tell you why that's all that matters, because you can protect your family. You can have a house over yourself. You've got the shelter. You don't need that part. You don't have it, though. I'm not going to tell you that you have it, but you don't need it. This is what you need. This is what I'm telling you, this is, although you think you care about that, this is why you care about it. Whereas the third option, and this is where I see compatibilism coming in, it's going, hey, mate, you do have $100 million. I've just checked it. But we have to redefine we have to redefine dollar. We have to redefine that value of money. It just seems to be deliberately avoiding the fact that it's not what he thinks it is. Does that analogy sit at all, or?
Well, I think there's a slight problem, but first of all, thanks for doing the conversion to dollars so that I didn't have to do that in my head. Um,
You're welcome.
but I think that what's happening here in objecting to compatibilists is it's like, oh, it's $100 million versus $1 million. And so we're focusing on the quantity, which is the various properties. And in both cases, what's fair to say is that you're getting free money. You're just
Yes.
not getting the free money that you thought you were.
Yeah.
And I think what compatibilists are saying is somebody saying, I'm getting free money and it's $100 million. And compatibilists are saying, no, you're getting free money. It's $1 million.
I see. So just to clarify, in that analogy, and you've just illustrated, it's definitely not perfect. What the person cares about is the money, and you're illustrating to him when you're coming into the conversation, saying you don't actually care about the money, you care about what the money gives you, and what the money gives you is shelter for your family, etc., like a happy life. Well, when it comes to free will, you're walking and you go and you can say, listen, free will doesn't exist, but the reason you care about free will is because you care about moral culpability. You care about people actually being responsible and treated responsible for their decisions. So you are detaching them. And I think the best way to detach that is by saying, listen, free will doesn't exist, but you do have will, and you get to retain all of the value that you care about. But you're focusing on the wrong thing. The free bit doesn't matter. This matters. And we agree on that. We both are trying to get that point across. It just seems that you're getting it across by saying, no, you do have free will, but we must redefine free will in a world, in a context, in a conversation that's happening where basically everybody means what most people mean, I should say, by free will, and fervently is completely against the way you're trying to redefine it. It's like a massive uphill battle, or you just use the word will. And if you have also, to layer on top of that, lots of religious people who need free will is the only thing I can see that's more important to most religions than creationism. So evolution was a massive sledgehammer to their beliefs because it ruins their creation stories. And that's why you have massive dislike for it. Well, not having free will buries it. And the thing is, we know we don't, not in that sense, not in the sense that they need it. So I think we will be doing a greater service to irreligion, to breaking down religion, by making the point that actually you really don't have free will. It just seems to be, as we were saying at the beginning, it's only about terms. We agree and we want the same thing. It's just we disagree with the right terms to use and how to get there. But I put a lot on the table. What?
No. So it's just fine. So now we're essentially, because we've decided that we agree on what we have and perhaps disagree on whether or not there's justification about what to call it. Now we're talking about the strategy behind that decision, which I get. I think that one of the biggest problems is, I don't necessarily want to lump you in, but I will for
Sure.
the sake of this. You and I have spent a great deal of time thinking about free will and all the issues surrounding it. And we've also studied what various philosophers have said. And so the context in which we're looking at this is not the context that the average person. As a matter of fact, I would bet that apart from just regurgitating something they've heard in the sermon, no member of my extended family has ever uttered the words free will or cared about the language surrounding free will apart from God gives you free will. And what they really mean is God allows you to make decisions and you're going to suffer the consequences for those decisions, which is true whether we're meat puppets or not. And so this may be some of an intellectual exercise that doesn't resonate with the everyman, which is probably my target audience. Because when I come up against, I sat down with a Calvinist one time for lunch, and they don't believe in free will. And we had a great lunch and a great discussion. And Calvinists have probably thought more about free will because it's much more a rigid structure within their theology than, Southern Baptists or anybody else.
For sure.
And I said, well, if you don't think you have free will, why are you out, proselytizing to people? And he looked at me in the eye and he says, I don't have any choice.
Yeah.
And so they have this view of will that is even more rigid and more constrained. They are not just meat puppets with self-reflection. They are God puppets that essentially don't make any decisions.
Hmm.
God just directs their life, and it's bizarre. But for others that come to me that say, "Oh, well, God gives you free will," I would tend to, in conversation, say, "Okay, what do you mean by that?" Because if you're talking about, if by free will you mean this, we know that that's not the case. If there's a bunch of stuff we don't know, but we can be pretty confident that the type of free will you're talking about doesn't exist. And then I can go on to clarify it. I don't tend to say, "Oh, you do have free will, it's just not the one you want."
No.
What I do is I tend to say, "You don't have the free will you want, but you have this, and there may be a justification for calling that free will as well."
Yeah. So you hit a great point on who you're communicating with. So if you're communicating with a tight circle of people that are interested in a certain subject, then you can define your terms. So I could define God to mean energy, and there's nothing wrong with that if the people I'm talking to know what I'm talking about. But
Yeah,
when people are saying that free will doesn't exist, they are communicating to more than just that circle. They're talking to competing circles interested in the same subject, and they're also talking to the masses at large when you're having those conversations. I've had plenty of conversations with theists about about free will, and I've at first I used to be a compatibilist. um, at first I used to use, no, you do have free will, but it's like this. And then after being called um, basically disingenuous enough times, I came to the opinion that it isn't sincere. It's better to just say that, listen, you don't have free will, but you do have will, and that's what matters. But it is a great point that you raise about where you're having that conversation, because then you can tie it into things such as evolution. It's called a theory. Well, that's only in the
right.
discourse of scientists. But when you talk to normal people, um, normal people as opposed to scientists, do
Yeah.
you say to them, oh, evolution's a theory? Or do you always have to follow that up with, but this is what a theory means? Or do you just say, no, for all intent and purposes, colloquially, evolution is a fact? It's only a theory if they want to go down that road, and you can explain what a theory is according to that language.
So I'm generally so anal and terrified of being misrepresented that on that front I would say evolution is a fact. The theory of evolution by natural selection
Yeah.
is the scientific theory that explains that. But I think there was a point you made about this. So you noted that we can use language. It's our tool. And so if somebody says, by God, I mean energy, now we can have a conversation, assuming you and I both agree. Here's the thing. You then followed it up by saying that it's better to just say free will doesn't exist. And the problem with that is you are lumping all connotations of free will under one banner and saying it's not real. There's a difference between saying free
So
will
how
doesn't
many are
exist.
there?
It would be like saying we need to say God doesn't exist, and then when somebody comes along and says, "No, by God I mean energy," and then you have to go, "Oh, well, of course energy exists." So it's about a precision in what we're actually
Okay,
denouncing.
so let's run with those terms. You have God, and you're
Okay.
completely right. I've met every person I meet that believes in a God has a different God to the person I've just met. At
Yeah.
least in the sense of whether or not they care about who I sleep with and in what position, etc. But
And also,
and
not to, I hate to interrupt. There's a difference between saying God doesn't exist and what I tend to do, which is point out there is no good reason to think that a God does exist, because that is more
yeah,
inclusive, is accepting of evidence.
that actually
And
comes brilliantly down to language,
yeah,
because if you want to be specific, you say there's no evidence for a God, or there's certainly not compelling, so therefore I don't believe in it. But when someone says there is no God, they mean that. It's just that's how you speak when you're not being sensitive to your words. And as you've
yes.
pointed out many, many times, I think it's a brilliant point that you've made. If you want to convince someone, what matters is that you're communicating. It doesn't matter about the words that are being used, etc. Um, but just before that, where was I? I've slightly lost myself.
Yeah, that I apologize. I'm
No,
I'm
no, not
bad
at
at
all.
that, but anyway, continue.
Yes, I think I continue. You were just saying about, okay, we had God, and there is a multitude of definitions. There really is. Like I said, there's probably more definitions really than there is, as many as there are believers in God. But when it comes to free will, how many definitions are there? Because from what I can see, there's really just one, apart from the new. I say new, it's not new. The compatibilist one that's coming in. Am I wrong there? Is there just one, or is there loads of different
There's just
definitions for
one
free will?
apart from the one. There's just one
Yeah,
apart
yeah.
from, which means there's two, at least two. And
Okay, yeah,
among
badly phrased.
philosophers, there's probably a parade of different models that allow varieties of freedom within will, which is why, I mentioned Dent's book before, The Varieties of Free Will Worth Wanting.
No, fantastic point. I should rephrase that. There's lots
I
of
think you actually
popular definitions of God.
I think you did
Say
something
again.
like
I
that.
could. Oh, fair enough. So you have lots of different definitions of gods that are quite popular. Hindu gods, different variations of the Abrahamic God through Islam, through Christianity, Catholicism, etc. When it comes to popular, frequently used definitions of free will, there doesn't seem to be so many. But
Correct.
you're completely right. There is lots of definitions, really, if you're going to
Or
count them.
even if there's only two. But yeah. And the other thing is, if we're talking from a strategic standpoint, and I'm not remotely claiming that I'm right or that I have the best strategy. I get emails about the show about, I can't stand to watch the show when you're on because you're an arrogant ass who talks down to people or whatever. And then I'll get another email from somebody else about the exact same call saying, wow, I almost believe in God because you have the patience of a saint. And the thing that I really caution people about is asserting something that adopts a burden of proof that you may not be able to meet. So for the mythicist crowd, I think they're overextending if they say that they can reasonably conclude Jesus didn't exist, rather than saying, wow, there is no reason to conclude Jesus actually existed. And this alone is a huge problem for Christianity. If you say God doesn't exist, you've now adopted a burden of proof. And if it turns out that the specific God or category of gods that you were talking about doesn't exist but differs from the person, you've made no headway. Whereas if you begin with, there's no reason to believe that a God exists, or maybe on the free will subject, there's no reason to believe that the traditional notions of free will are in any way real. I'm fine with
Yes.
that because I haven't adopted any, I'm willing to be shown. If you have an argument and evidence for a traditional view of free will or whatever your version is, I'm willing to accept it. And if it turns out your version isn't traditional, I'm still not wrong. I haven't been presented evidence for the traditional model, but you have the compatibilist model, which I'm willing to accept. If this is all about strategy, then I have to go back to the likelihood that there are probably as many right approaches as there are people who have views on this, because I can say something to someone and it will have no impact. Is that because there's a personality conflict? Is that because there was a language issue, something that wasn't properly defined? What I suspect happens more often than not is the example I've used is the 3 on a match is bad luck thing. It's an old war analogy. If you're in the trenches, the first guy lights a cigarette, nothing happens. The second guy lights a cigarette, nothing happens. Then the third guy lights a cigarette and he gets his head blown off, because across the field, the first guy lit a cigarette and the sniper said, wow, what was that? And the second guy lit his cigarette and he's like, oh, that's what it is. And the third guy lights it and he gets shot. I think when people are first presented with an idea that's foreign to them, that there's a likelihood God didn't exist or that they don't have free will or anything else, it's just weird. And it gets dismissed because it's too foreign to the models in their head. And the second time it's, hey, I've heard this before. Maybe there's something here. And the third time is when we have a pattern. And as pattern recognition machines, that it may be the case that it has nothing to do with me saying it to them didn't have an effect. It might have been the first time. And it might, who knows? You could come along and say the exact thing that I said the next day, and they could go, well, duh. Of course I should have known
Yeah.
that. And so if this is about the strategy, in much the same way that I have no objections to somebody calling it will, and I have no objections to people saying libertarian free will is nonsense, or the varieties of Christian free will or theistic free will clearly don't have any correlate in reality. And in fact, when I talk to believers, on the rare occasions that free will comes up, and it's pretty rare. My favorite thing is if you're talking to a Christian, they'll probably use it in the sense of God won't reveal himself to you because this would violate your free will, because everybody would be compelled to believe in a God if he would reveal himself. And he wants you to freely choose this. And my response is, okay, do you believe in Satan? And as long as they say yes, they now have to acknowledge that they believe that there's a being who's been in God's presence, who knows God's power, who God has clearly revealed himself to, and yet chose to rebel.
Mm.
And if Satan can do that, then we have to be able to do it, especially if they're going to argue that Satan is here to guide us to make that decision. So their use of free will, even if it were real,
Mm.
fails. And so I'd much rather have that argument. The only time I have free will arguments about compatibilism is I didn't even have this argument with the Calvinists. It's with other atheists and
Yeah.
other philosophy geeks who are like, oh, no, we should just call it will.
Well,
And
you bring up. Sorry, I just want to jump in there. You brought in a good point at the end there, saying that it's atheists that bring it up. I think there's partly a reason for that. This debate is partly about strategy. It's not mainly it's about language and about what's best to use, but there is a part that's about strategy. In the US, you have this in the UK as well. To use atheism as an analogy, you have lots of people who don't believe in a god, but they go under different terms. So you have atheism, agnosticism, irreligious. You have people that just go for Jedi and giant spaghetti monster, etc. And
yeah,
the voices are just killed because there's no unity. Whereas if they were put into one, which you can do if you just say, look, this is the definition, they do all fit it, then there's a lot more weight and a lot more power behind that. It's a similar thing with free will and determinists like me. I can tell you now that the reason why I made the video, the reason why I want this conversation, and maybe it's the reason why the backlash you get is from atheists, is because you're on my side. It's just because of the words that you're using, you don't look like you are to anyone that's not paying attention, and most people are not paying attention.
that
Um,
I think is fair.
and I think that is a big problem with this. And people get to define their own terms when they identify by a label, of course. And then you see religious people going again to the analogy. Lots of Christians will say, "I'm a Christian." It's really high rated, and they're very well categorized. And yet we're not as irreligious people, and we're not when it comes to the illusion of free will. And it's almost entirely because of this redefinition of free will, when the word will is perfectly suffice, and it gets the message across, in my opinion, more clearly. So to go back round in the loop kind of thing, it is a very interesting debate or discussion that we're having, because it's so weird to be having the exact same position as somebody else and it just being about words.
Yeah, no, that's the thing that's probably, I mean, granted, both in the video and here, you've said a number of things that I completely agree with, but this one resonates the most because I have constantly talked about how much I hate bad arguments and strategies, but I hate them most when they're coming from the people who ostensibly are on my side of an issue, or what I think is the right side of an issue, whether it's, you know, the Nazi punching arguments, or the let's make really bad arguments against Christians or theists, or let's portray theists as stupid. Or, you know, I had a guy write the other day to talk about how, you know, in his view, the average IQ of the person who calls our show is about 85, and how we should be kinder and gentler to them. And I wrote back and I was like, wow, you're so arrogant. I have no idea how to respond to you. You basically and explicitly referred to them as mentally handicapped, as if they have one arm, etc. You say all this, and yet you're wanting me to be kinder and gentler, when I'd rather just speak truthfully and presume that the person, as a default, that the person is capable of changing their mind and understanding reason, and then only concluding that they can't when I actually have evidence for that. But instead, you know, you think you're the IQ whisperer and can determine, as if that was relevant. Because I know people who have probably an 85 IQ who understand at least the topic we're talking about, me and the gentleman in the email, far better than you do. So what's my IQ, jackass? You know, it was, if you're so good at this. And because I've talked about this idea of bad arguments and strategy, I can completely see where you're coming from. It's just that I would agree that it's bad strategy to run around saying, yes, we have free will. Yes, we have free will. Yes, we have free will. It just means this, which I don't think is anything that I've ever done. And I was always talking about when I tend to talk about this, it's we don't have these things, these varieties of free will, but I think there's something that we have that
Okay, so no, sorry to interrupt, but you wording it that way, it's still the same message, is it not?
is it to say that the free will
Yeah,
you think you have, you don't?
I think it can be construed that way. So if you come up to somebody who believes in free will and you say, so what was the word you used? I don't want to put words in your mouth.
I don't know which word you're referencing.
It was the words you just used when you come into contact with someone who does believe in free will, as the libertarian sense, and you say you don't have the free will that you think you have,
You
but
do.
you have
But you have something
this.
that I think could reasonably be called free will, and then you describe it. That's like saying you
Is
didn't get the free money that you thought you got, but you did get something that counts as free money, and here's what it
Mhm.
is.
But at the end of the day, you are telling them you didn't get the money that you think you've got.
Correct.
Yeah, and if they are caring more about the number of the money
Yep.
rather than what they can do with a smaller amount of money,
Yep.
it's still the same message. It's just because I agree with
No,
your central point.
it's if I find out that that's what they care about,
Yeah.
then that's what we focus on. It is just false that you got $100 million. Similarly, when we talk about morality, Sam and I have used well-being. And at the end of the day, if I've had many arguments with people who say that's not morality, what
Mhm.
morality is this and only this. And my response to them is to say, fine, then I don't give a rat's ass about morality. I care about well-being. Do you? And it turns out that we can now have a conversation where they agree, so it's a staged progression. I think the big issue is that I'm not convinced. If there are people who are afraid, legitimately afraid of the prospect that they don't have free will in any sense, that they are being whipped around by the winds and, uh, can't even be a self-reflective acting agent, um, then letting them know that they in fact are a self-reflecting acting agent as far as we can tell, and that they have a will which is either free from constraints of others or not. Maybe viewing free will more like free speech, of specifically talking about the limits on it. Um, that conversation can be had. And if I run up against somebody who says, no, free will is this and only this, then I am as quick as anybody to say, yeah, that's not real.
Yeah.
So I think the concern is that when I see what I see Sam doing, even in the conversation we had, is roughly the equivalent of that, of saying, no, you don't have free will in any sense. And what the compatibilists are saying that you have as free will isn't free according to the standard. So it shouldn't count as free at all.
So if you look at what was really being said before compatibilism, and I understand it's quite far back, but if you're looking at that, free will meant one thing really. I don't want to fall into that trap again, but you know what I'm saying. It's
Yeah,
you
I understand.
are autonomous in that sense. That's what Harris is getting at. So you're right to say what you just said, because he's saying you don't have free will, period. But that's because he's doing it almost as an opposition to someone else coming in and saying you do have free will, but it's not free will, which is where it's coming into that trap of saying you real paranormal magic is fake, but fake paranormal magic is real.
So
I
I
mean,
view that as a bit of a fallacious appeal to tradition, but it gets to the last
yeah,
note I had about your video, where I'll let you clarify this, but you said um, it's not okay to redefine a word, but it is okay to make a new definition and label the old one nonsense or archaic. But creating a new definition and labeling the old one nonsense or archaic is redefining the word. It just doesn't happen instantaneously. It's a process. And I think what compatibilists are trying to do is say, yes, everything that people have normatively, traditionally viewed as free will is garbage, but there is a context in which this concept, which has value, is still free in a context. And what we can do is add this as another variety of free will, phase out the old until this becomes the new standard. Dennett may be doing it to avoid, potential disasters around it. But I think there's value in doing that. But I'm not necessarily, I've said this several times, I'm not necessarily tied to it. I think that there's a number of different ways to go about this. But when you say redefining a word isn't okay, but it's okay to add a new definition and label the old one archaic, how is that not redefining a word?
Okay, so there's several things that you were saying there, and I've within this conversation, I've realised more of the differences between you and Dennett. I don't really actually see that many problems with your
Knows what
approach.
he's talking about.
No. I think your position's more defensible than his, even though, of course, much of what you say is his. It's because of the layer that he puts on top, and that actually it's better to keep the illusion because of certain arguments that he's referenced. I think that the approach that you take, that works, where you can redefine the word in that sense. There's nothing wrong with it, but when you apply that to the context of the conversation that's currently happening, I think the better way to achieve the goal that we both want, the statements that we're both saying, is to just use the word will, because it's an easier path to do so. There's no you're not going to have to caveat all the time. There's certain walls that you're not going to hit. As for what I was saying about redefining words, I actually listened to that back myself, and I was a bit clumsy in the words that I used. What I was getting at is, I don't think it's fair for Lawrence to go around. He doesn't do it so much now, but I've seen it on other panels saying, no, the universe came from nothing, and then only 45 minutes later really revealing what he means by nothing. And it's because he's just redefined the word in that sense. It represents the confusion that you get with calling free will. But if you start off very explicitly, which I can tell that you do, by saying almost immediately, this isn't what I mean by free will, this is what I mean by free will, then it's fine. But it's not fine when it's done in the way, the approach that I've seen Lawrence do it. It actually reminds me a little bit of how Peterson does it with the word truth. In some areas, he just doesn't reveal what he means by truth explicitly and upfront. And to a large extent, that's why he gets a lot of attention, because people don't pay enough attention to actually listen to the way he's actually using it later on. So as a response to what you were saying, I think it is fine to redefine free will the way that you want to. It's just, I think the approach of calling it will is different, and I don't know if we're going to get much past that, apart from criticizing each other's analogies.
Yeah, I completely agree. And this was one of the things when Cross said it when we were on stage, that he uses nothing in a different context, and I pointed out Sam and I would use well-being for morality, and so I think the three are a little different. I think that well-being, as you pointed out in the video, is a clear core aspect of everything morality has traditionally been, even if people have glommed other things onto it. I think that the free portion of free will, as a compatibilist would do it, is not as clearly justified as the connection between well-being and morality, and may be problematic. But I don't think either of those are nearly as problematic as Lawrence's redefinition of nothing, because it's coming from almost nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of blindsiding you. At least when I talk about the types of free will that I would perhaps justify as being free, I'm providing a context. When it comes to nothing, he's giving you the characteristics of nothing, which automatically makes it something under all. So that's a bigger problem.
Yeah.
What if I were to say traditional free will isn't real or believable, but you still have will, and whether or not you find a compatibilist way to include the free modifier doesn't matter that much to me? Is there a problem with that?
there isn't a problem with that, but you go under the banner of a compatibilist, and that's the way people don't interpret the broader field of compatibilism as that. Whereas I think they would if you were. You're laughing, so tell me where I tripped.
I just didn't want to interrupt. So, what if I were to say traditional compatibilism is wrong, but there's still
Okay.
compatibilism, and whether or not you find a way to include, you could do the same thing forever. It'd be,
Okay.
turtles all the way down. I'm definitely I'm only a compatibilist in the sense that I agree with Dennett's foundations of what he portrayed as compatibilist. I find that there may be some good reasons to include some free class modifier, even though it doesn't match up with the traditional one. And it may be, as I pointed out, closer to like free speech than it is to free from constraints. Um, I don't, I don't have to identify myself as a compatibilist at all. As a matter of fact, I don't find the term particularly useful because in most of the conversations around free will, if I say I'm a compatibilist, the only people who have any understanding of that are compatibilists or people who spend a lot of time doing it. Even in Sam's book on free will, where he basically says, I don't understand compatibilism. It seems like they're just defining it. And Dennett has said that Sam is a compatibilist. He just doesn't know it.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, then it may be, of all the words we've discussed being problematic today, the compatibilist is the true problem more than free. If that's the case, I'll drop that in a hot minute because if the goal is to communicate what is and isn't, or what is reasonable to believe, I'll drop any word like, I have no idea what spirituality means. I despise that word. And so it's very frustrating. Sam and I talked about this after the Chicago event where he had talked about losing the sense of self. And I was like, even if you could do that, I don't know why it's a good thing. If it's a source of pain and suffering, it's also the source of joy, isn't it? Why would it? But he talked about his own frustration with using the word spiritual or spirituality for the same reasons I object to him. It's just that he can't find a better word to kind of describe this. And it struck me as so hilarious that he can say this 20 minutes after he's going to criticize Dan for not finding a better phrase than free.
Yeah.
So we're kind of, maybe we're muddling through this a little bit, but yeah, I don't care if I ever call myself a compatibilist again.
No, I mean, ultimately, what you were just saying about Sam Harris and the word spirituality, I can't speak for him, and hopefully you have
And
another
I'm not either.
discussion with him. No, of course. Caveats all the way around. But I think what he might say is that people don't immediately inherently experience something that they would call spirituality, and they share the same opinion. Whereas that is the case with free will. People were born with this illusion. It's incredibly powerful, and it's only really in the last several centuries that we've realized that it's not the case. And it's always going to be the case that people were born with this sensation that's traditionally been called free will. And so he just thinks it's better to approach that by not redefining the word, but instead by saying it doesn't exist. But we can hear now. Now we're open to a real conversation, etc. But
So as the overly pedantic debate dude, what difference does it make how long someone has held a view? What difference does it make whether someone has been convinced of something their entire life, or for the last 15 years of their life, or for the last 20 minutes? The key is that they are convinced of something and it's inaccurate.
I think it's more the case that it's not about how long they've personally been convinced. It's more about we are born and we experience. Most of us, once we become of an age where we're conscious, we experience it in that way. So it's not like an appeal to population or appeal to tradition in that sense. It's more about the fact that the default position is that people share the same illusion, and so that's why he would say with the word spirituality, it means different things to different people. Whereas in that sense, that elite, whatever you call it, that experience seems to be inherent with anyone that has basically consciousness. But again, I can't speak for him, and you'll be better off having that conversation with him.
Yeah, and there are more conversations upcoming. I'm hoping to have a conversation with Dennett at some point.
Yeah.
His schedule hasn't allowed it, but it's on the list So one thing happened that was curious. One relatively significant individual gave a talk about compatibilism that was a complete trashing of compatibilism that I felt misrepresented both my own thoughts and Dennett's as a way of kind of dismissing this. And after it was over, I found myself, this is awful, in a 4 or 5 way discussion as the lone compatibilist with the individual who gave the talk and several other PhDs, multi-PhD, blah, 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 in various disciplines, only one of them in philosophy. And I'm the lone guy going after this. And one thing that came up from several of them is that they deny that we are even agents. Their view of our lack of free will means that they will not acknowledge that we are agents, that we have agency.
Would that go down to how they define agency? Because I define it in the same way as you, which is it just means exactly. But I can understand that a lot of people will say, well, that's because they see agency with it, what is implicitly necessary with that is a free will. They would say that agency doesn't exist. It might just be a language thing going on there.
It is a bit of a language thing, but here's the thing. So they've become convinced that we don't have free will in any sense. And then once they chuck out the idea of free will, they chuck out the agency. So now they're essentially the rough equivalent of the hardline Calvinists, only as atheists. Now, I'm with Sam that I would like to see a better understanding of the human brain and where we can make determinations about agents' motivations and what we can and can't correct for, remove the tumor, give them a drug, whatever, so that we get away from a vengeance and retribution model of justice. Although I do still think that, if I kill you and I have a tumor and we remove the tumor, I'm clearly no longer a danger. So, we probably shouldn't be locking me up, maybe at all, or perhaps not forever. But there may still be some benefit to society to say, even though you are no longer this danger, there still needs to be some compensation for the action you took. Just as if you broke my window, you're still going to have to pay for it, whether it was a tumor or.
Sam Harris actually said we would put earthquakes in prison if we could. It doesn't matter if they're an agent in that sense. What matters is that we want to prevent bad things happening and allowing for good things. With the people that we're rejecting agency, however it was defined, what I found is many people, me and you, are in a minority in the sense that we believe that morality is objective. And if you have somebody that doesn't believe in free will and is a moral relativist, then it removes the motives a bit. So it doesn't matter about having free will because you have the motives behind you, because you see that well-being is the answer. In your case, it's human well-being. And so that plays into the agency part, I would say. But it's,
That was kind of a side note, because I think, unless I'm much mistaken about what just happened, I think we started off almost entirely in agreement and ended almost entirely in agreement, including I would drop compatibilist. And when I do talk about free will, I plan to always include clarification. And I have no problem with also referring to it as will, but I don't know if I'm going to immediately. I worry that there's an impact of saying you don't have free will, you just have will. That is different from the impact of saying you don't have the free will you think you do, you have will. It may or may not be free, depending, to show that there's these subtleties afterwards. In much the same way that
is that the same present, different package, or because it does matter the way things are presented? Is that what you're saying there?
Yeah, it's for people who think that without a God, the world will descend into chaos. Starting off with there is no God, which is already a mistake of adopting a burden of proof that I don't think is reasonable. But starting off trying to convince them that they don't have a good reason to believe there's a God may not be the best course of action. But for somebody else, it absolutely could be. And the prime example that I've used, I hope I don't ruin anybody's Christmas, is Santa Claus. There are people who give up their belief in Santa Claus just without any prodding. Maybe they never accepted it, whatever. There are others who do a little investigating, find the presents hidden in the closet, watch for mom and dad and stay up later and all this other stuff. And then there are some people who don't give it up until they're made fun of on the bus to school of, oh, you still believe in Santa Claus? You're a little kid. And I don't think we should ever start with the third one, but I certainly don't think ridicule should be aimed at the people, but I'm fine with ridicule being aimed at ideas. But even as often as I'm prone to ridiculing ideas, I don't think I ever would justify starting there. And so when it's a strategy, I'm trying to figure out, what does this person believe and why? What is their attachment to this free will idea? Because if they have this really narrow thing, I'm fine with saying, yeah, that's not real. Not only do we not have good reason to believe it exists, but here's reasons why we can be fairly confident it doesn't. But if I'm talking with someone who's latched onto this notion of free will mainly because they're fearful of what does this say about them if they don't have the free will they've always had, then I think there's a benefit to saying you might have a variety of free will with or without the free label that satisfies all the things that you're concerned about. So I think it's mostly just, let's not take shortcuts.
Essentially, the approach of seeing what people believe and then going from there is something that we both agree on. And there might be a point to be said about the strategy of demonstrating to people that they don't have that free will. But when you ask them, what do you mean by free will? They'll either answer with, it's the free part, which is the equivalent of saying it's the underwater Atlantis part, or they'll answer with, it's the moral agency, which will be, it's the fact that it's a city. And we can address that accordingly. If most people were saying, it doesn't even most people, if the individual we're speaking to are saying that that's the bit that matters, or that's the bit they're concerned about, then you can say that Atlantis exists, but it's Sicily. But if what they're concerned about is the free part, then I think it's better to say that that doesn't that doesn't exist, essentially. Sorry, I was just seeing your comment there. I got slightly.
No, and I think you're exactly right, which is why one of the first things that I wanted to acknowledge is that when I talked about what most people think of when they think of free will, that was completely unjustified and inaccurate on my part and wholly retracted. It began with my own, it was injected with massive amounts of bias for me of, once we get rid of libertarian free will, what else is there to care about? And so that's retracted. And by the way, for the people who watch this, and go back and watch Stephen's other video, and the references there, if there's something we didn't address, you're probably safe in assuming that I've already conceded that point, unless it directly conflicts something here. But I don't know.
Okay.
We're largely on the same page, even more than we were before.
Awesome. No, that's cool. Last thing I wanted to ask you essentially is my point on morality, where you were saying that that Sam was redefining morality, and I was saying he wasn't. It's always been about concerns about right and wrong. He's just saying that it's not a moral edict. It's actually got to do with well-being. Did you accept that criticism, or is that one that you don't accept?
No. I accept that, which is why when I clarified that thing, that I think Sam's morality and well-being, which is also mine, is a much more justified, not necessarily it may be so justified that it doesn't count as a redefinition, but there are people who will view it as a redefinition. That one's more justified than the free and free will, which is more justified than Lawrence Krauss's redefinition of nothing. Is that?
So yeah, just one time to clarify. So you do think that Sam is redefining morality? Was that I kind of blanked a little bit. I'm sorry about that.
Sure. I think there are people who have a view of morality that don't give a rat's ass about well-being, and from those people's perspective, Sam's redefining it. I just think that even if it were to be enough of a change to be called a redefinition, it is entirely justified. And if you could talk to those people, the only people who are going to object are the ones that are just going straight to like divine command. Morality is what God says no matter what, whether it's in our best interest or not. And I'd like to think, although I don't have data, that is a vanishing segment even of the theistic community. So I'm not I'm not so much convinced that Sam has redefined it. I can understand the people who think he has, but when I've been challenged that we're redefining it, my answer is fine. Let's get rid of morality. If the word's getting in the way, do you care about well-being? Because that's what I'm talking about. And then if you can get agreement, then you can maybe make the case for why they should consider this morality, or at a minimum, chuck out the morality label altogether and say, wow, I not only care about well-being in the model that you've described, I care about that more than I care about the thing that I used to refer to as morality. Essentially, if God's not a humanist, screw him.
Yeah. Just as an irony that I've just noticed is when it comes to morality, we're kind of on the different sides of the page. And this, like, I'm the compatibilist when it comes to this, because I'm saying that no, morality has always been defined about what's good and what's bad, and that is the underwater bit that people are concerned about, and that exists. Whereas you can just go, no, it doesn't exist at all. But here's how you can angle it.
The difference is it's always been about what's good and what's bad. But Sam's saying the foundation for what's good and what's bad is well-being.
Yeah.
And the
Okay,
divine
cool.
command, people are saying what's the foundation of what's good and what's bad is about what God says, irrespective of our well-being. And that is a
Okay.
real thing you have to deal with, because that, it may not be the biggest chunk of theists, but it's a good chunk of evangelicals. And at the end of the day, you know, I grew up as a Southern Baptist. Hey, you just got to take it on faith that God has your best interests at heart. But even if he doesn't, too bad, he's God.
No, well, on that note, because thanks for answering that question. I don't want to take you any longer. Thanks for making the time to have this conversation. It's been wonderful speaking with you. It's
I would hope we can do it again on other topics and stuff.
Whatever you just said, my computer slightly lagged, but
I was just saying I would hope that we could do it again on other topics at some point. This was very enjoyable.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I won't take you any longer, and so I shall stop the broadcast. Thank you for everybody listening, and yeah, nothing else to say really.